Antonis ILIOPOULOS, I switch to English. It's a great pleasure to have Antonis here because Antonis works at the University of Oxford. He's a young, talented scholar that has written some, in my opinion, spectacular works on the connection between, on crossover between pragmatism, cognitive science, and ethnography in some way. So he has worked at the ERC project Handmade, directed by Lambert Malafouris, and he worked a lot on the connection between material engagement, semiotics. He was the signification in the project, in the Handmade project. So he is a friend and also connected to the Cognitive Association of Semiotics, Cognitive Semiotics Association. So welcome here, Antonis. We can't wait to listen to your presentation. And I'm sure that your interdisciplinary point of view will be something that will be important for us.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. As you can see on this slide, in this presentation, I'll be talking about the prehistory of visual signification through the case of early body ornamentation. I'll be specifically attempting to address a key question about the so-called human becoming, namely, how did Homo sapiens become a symbolic species? Following a material turn, much like the one Claudio talked about, I'll be suggesting that symbolism was acquired through protracted processes of cognitive and semiotic scaffolding by material artifacts, such as early body ornaments that might have adorned the necks and by extension the faces of our ancestors. So with this general idea in mind, let us start with a brief outline just so you can get a sense of how this presentation will unfold. As you can see on this slide, the presentation will consist of 4 sections. The first one is obviously the introduction, where I'll be giving you some background about the field of cognitive archaeology, familiarizing you with the key questions we ask, a major debate we have, the archaeological evidence we look at, our traditional way of thinking about material science, and of course, some problematic tendencies still held on to. In the second section, I'll be outlining a theoretical framework that I think can help us overcome the problematic assumptions still plaguing the field. As you can see, I'll be specifically composing a pragmatic and enactive theory of cognitive semiotics. In the next section, I apply this composite theory to an archaeological case study with the aim of illuminating how early body ornaments help bring forth symbolism. And finally, in the conclusion, I'll be recounting some key findings as well as highlighting the need for interdisciplinary approaches that combine cognitive archaeology with visual semiotics. With this plan in mind, let's start setting the scene with the introductory section. The archaeology of mind, as it is also known, has been broadly defined by famed archaeologist Colin Renfrew as the study of past ways of thinking through the material remains that have been unearthed. Important to note at the outset is that cognitive archaeology does not attempt to identify what people thought, but rather how they carried out their thinking in interaction with others and the material world. The archaeology of mind is thus primarily interested in learning about the different situated processes of human thought as they emerge and take shape in the different cultural trajectories of our species. The origins of modern human behavior and cognition hold a central stage in evolutionary and cognitive archaeology. Symbolism, in particular, is generally accepted as the most defining characteristic of modernity. The archaeological scope has thus been primarily focused on symbolic material proxies, such as personal adornments. Up until the turn of the millennium, the hallmark of personal ornamentation had been associated with the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. So think about 40 to 50,000 years ago. Recent evidence, however, suggests that ornaments emerged tens of thousands of years earlier, during the African Middle Stone Age and the Near Eastern Middle Paleolithic, so about 70 to 100,000. On this slide, you can see the locations of the 10 sites that have yielded Middle Stone Age ornamental cell beads. As you can see, there are 4 Moroccan, 1 Algerian, 2 Israeli, and 3 South African sites. Now, for a bit of background of the material that has recently stirred much discussion. This is a notable set of Nassarius kraussianus cell beads unearthed at Lombos Cave, South Africa, and dated to approximately 75,000 years ago. And these are Nassarius gibosulus cell beads discovered at Grotte de Pigeon, Morocco, which were dated to approximately 82,000 years ago. Here you can see some more specimens from the same site. For most archaeologists, these artifacts provide unequivocal evidence for the symbolic and, by extension, modern cognitive capacities of Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic humans. Their first postulate is that all significant artifacts had been imbued with arbitrary meaning that was syntactically arranged. Beads, for instance, were purportedly used in building syntactically organized visual arrangements that communicated particular meanings about the wearer's wealth, status, etc. And according to the second postulate, form and meaning were a priori defined by a symbolically capable brain. In other words, the shapes and concepts imbued into the thick cells were externalized according to mental templates defined by a neurocognitively evolved brain. It seems that this common approach entails a couple important theoretical assumptions. Firstly, a linguistic notion of the material sign, according to which signification unfolds through purely arbitrary means. Essentially, an artifact stands for something else because their connection has been established and explicitly agreed upon through language. And secondly, the representational or computational view of the mind, according to which cognition unfolds in an internal apparatus that processes representation, which are formed through the computation of information from and about the external world before materializing them through behavior. This means that an artifact stands for something else because it was deliberately made according to internally formed templates, for instance, about wealth or status. Adopting, though, a linguistic notion of the sign and a representational view of cognition means succumbing to a couple of fallacies that Malafouris calls the fallacy of the linguistic sign and the representational fallacy. For one, the fallacy of the linguistic sign means equating the sign with arbitrariness, disregarding the fact that the non-discursive qualities of a material sign, such as texture, color, smell, and position, can also affect its meaning. It therefore recognizes only the referentially communicative capacity of the sign, treating it as a disembodied, internalized conceptual link between the signifier and the signified, and thus deprives material culture from having an action-constitutive role within the semiotic system. Moreover, in treating material culture as text, it leaves one wondering where to start reading it and how to proceed thereafter. And finally, it overlooks the role of the interpreter of the sign, which certainly affects its meaning, as each interpreter has a distinct background. Given these facts, it seems that the archaeology of mind would probably be best served if it moved past the linguistic take on material signification. Let us now move on to the second major shortcoming, the representational fallacy. For one, viewing human cognition as a computational device that is inherently disembedded from the world is inaccurate, because it disregards its ecological situatedness and cannot therefore account for most real-life cognitive tasks, which require an embodied engagement with the material world. Moreover, purporting that cognitive modules can harbor innate categories that represent the world fails to justify how the brain, as a physical system, can know aspects of the world prior to their empirical instantiation. Finally, prioritizing brain reorganization over behavioral or material changes is problematic because the flow of cause and effect between brain and material culture is in fact bidirectional. In light of these facts, cognitive archaeologists should probably abandon the representational take on material culture. In order to overcome these fallacies, perhaps we can adopt a pragmatic and an active take on human becoming. In particular, material signification should be described through Peirce's pragmatic semiotic theory, which describes the meaning of mental concepts grounded on concrete experience. And human cognition should be seen through the prism of Malafouris's hypothesis of enactive signification, which describes the cognitive mechanisms that anchor the meaning of novel concepts to the material world. This presentation will thus be advancing a theoretical framework that is suitably geared to trace both the nature and emergence of visual signs in the human mind before applying it to our case study, in order to trace the emergence of symbolism through the semiotic scaffolding provided by the early body ornaments. Having said this, let's now move on to sketching a pragmatic and an active theory of cognitive semiotics that should later help us make sense of the archaeological evidence. I start this methodological section by showing how we can describe the nature of material science through Peirce's tenfold descriptive typology. I will then suggest that we can trace the emergence of material science by drawing upon Malafouris's hypothesis of enactive signification. And I will finally acknowledge a distinction between two kinds of indexical material science, what Göran Sonson calls abductive and performative indices. Shifting our perspective from the semiotically simplistic approach common in cognitive archaeology to a detailed take on semiosis requires a terminologically rich vocabulary that is imperative if we are to really appreciate the multidimensional dynamics of meaning. As Renfrew recognized in his inaugural lecture at Cambridge, cognitive archaeology and semiotics are destined to tread an uneasy path between the pretentiously jargon-laden and the blindingly obvious. The cognitive semiotic theory outlined in this section should thus be expected to rely on a variety of terms because each one of them is essential in gaining a deeper understanding of meaning-making processes. So starting with Peircean semiotics, besides talking about the kinds of relation between the sign and what it stands for, that is, its semiotic object, Peirce had also talked about the kinds of relation between the sign and itself, as well as that between the sign and the idea it generates, that is, its semiotic interpretant. The three types of triadic relations outlined by Peirce coalesce in forming 10 levels of signification that allow us to describe the semiotic nature of material science pretty accurately. As you can see, this typology is able to capture a broad spectrum of meaning, ranging from feelings on one end of the spectrum, diagrams and demonstrative pronouns in the middle, and syllogisms at the other end. In fact, the 10 classes of signs are hierarchically structured, with higher order signs embodying lower order signs. Please note that in this lattice, I have tried to explain Peirce's terms in my own words in order to make his jargon-laden terminology a bit easier to digest. So please take this diagram with a pinch of salt. Having said this, I should note that the black arrows point toward the embodied lower order signs that provide the foundations for higher order signs. Whereas the other two types of arrows are special in that they point towards special cases of lower order signs. The green arrows point towards peculiar synth signs that are real world instantiations, that is, replicas, governed by general rules, that is, legisigns. And the orange arrows point to peculiar icons, that do not just resemble their objects, but are actually modified by them. The interrelations between these kinds of signification shall become apparent later when I apply them to early body ornamentation. For now, suffice it to say that the lower level iconic and indexical signs can be taken to scaffold higher level symbolic signs, such as prepositions and syllogisms. Having considered the tenfold typology that lets us describe the nature of material signs, we now need a hypothesis that illuminates the cognitive mechanisms that enable a substantive entity to become a material sign. To this extent, let's turn to Malafouris's hypothesis of enactive signification, advanced within the context of his material engagement theory, a radical framework in cognitive archaeology according to which a material sign emerges through a process of embodied conceptual integration that is based on the anchoring of cognitive projections upon material culture. This hypothesis is based on Hudson's work on material anchors for conceptual blends, which is in turn based on Fauconnier and Turner's conceptual blending theory. On this slide, you can see a conventional conceptual blend on the left. As you can see, it only involves circles, which represent mental spaces. On the right, however, you can see a conceptual blend with a material anchor. As you can see, it also contains squares, which represent materially based mental spaces. An example of a materially anchored blend is the cube, where it is a conceptual blend of a line of people with an imagined trajectory that forms the cube in the blended space. As has been argued by Malafouris, such materially anchored blending can also account for the creation of early material signs. I would also like to recognize here two kinds of indexical signification. As has been proposed by Sonneson, abductive indices describe states of affairs and generally necessitate prior knowledge in order to be properly interpreted, as in the case of fingerprints. Whereas performative indices create states of affairs and require little knowledge because the creation of meaning is spontaneous, as in the case of a pointing finger. As I see it, prolonged material engagement would have familiarized early humans with these two dimensions of material signification, therefore enabling them to comprehend that a significant thing can both describe and create another thing. Individuals would have therefore formed some of their first beliefs about material signs. On this point, let us summarize the theoretical framework I have been outlining so as to underline some key points it can help us with. So for one, signs are not all arbitrary. Their meanings can range from qualitative possibilities to denotative iconic instantiations, denotative indexical instantiations, and informative indexical instantiations, all the way up to propositions and finally full-blown syllogisms. Also, signs are not the epiphenomenal products of templates harbored by the brain. They emerge through a process of conceptual blending that is anchored to the material world. And finally, indexical signs do not just describe states of affairs, they also create them. Let us now apply this theoretical framework to our case study for the purpose of tracing how early body ornaments help bring forth symbolic material culture. As I would like to suggest, cell beads could have provided the basis for the emergence of iconic concepts, such as value, because it would have been difficult to procure and skill and time-consuming to make. Value is neither an a priori state of a brain-bound homunculus, nor an inherent property of external objects. It is a feeling of nothing but itself, which emerges through direct experience of a particular relation between one's motor attitude and the conditions of the physical environment. According to Dewey's theory of valuation, acts and materials are actively valued when they provide the conditions for satisfying a person's need. Cell beads would have thus been valued for being rare and coveted objects capable of satisfying aesthetic and social needs. From a cognitive point of view, the beadwork would have come to provide the material anchor for the automatic and transparent cognitive projections that blended the mental and the material domains until establishing the beadwork as a sign for value. As you can see in the figure, the material and the mental space are brought together in the blended space in order to yield the iconic concept of value. In terms of Peirce's tenfold typology, the interpretation of early body ornaments would have been guided by the denotative iconic rule, whose meaning would have involved appreciating that such cell beads signify value. The denotative iconic rule would have been used to guide the interpretation of denotative iconic instantiations, or replicas of valuable ornaments, whose meaning would have involved noting that these cell beads signify value. And the denotative iconic instantiations of valuable ornaments would have in turn embodied qualitative possibilities of rarity and value. The interactions between Middle Stone Age humans would have also given them the opportunity to think about and conceptualize their wealth. This novel concept would have emerged through a perceptual association between the faces and bodies of decorated individuals and their possession of valuable cell beads. As signs of wealth, cell beads would have described the capacity of their wearer, as in the case of abductive indices, signifying one's ability to accumulate coveted artifacts. Yet at the same time, beadworks would have also conferred this trait to their wearer, as in the case of performative indices creating the wealth of their work. As I would like to suggest, it is through this bidirectionality between describing and creating states of affairs that humans came to grasp indexical concepts about themselves and others. From a cognitive perspective, wearing particular beadworks would have enabled the process of conceptual blending that established the beadwork as a sign for its wearer's wealth. As you can see in the figure, the material and the mental space are brought together in a blended space in order to yield the concept of wealth. In terms of Peirce's tenfold typology, the interpretation of early body ornaments would have been guided by an informative indexical rule, whose meaning would have involved grasping that such cell beads signify their wearer's wealth. This informative indexical rule would have embodied a denotative iconic rule, according to which beadworks are signs of value, along with a denotative indexical rule that indicates the wearer whose value or wealth is of concern. In addition, the informative indexical rule would have been used to guide the interpretation of informative indexical instantiations or replicas of decorated individuals, whose meaning would have involved understanding that these cell beads signify their wearer's wealth. Along similar lines, an X number of other iconic and indexical concepts could have emerged through habitualization. Their cohabitation in the same sign vehicle could have eventually brought forth symbolic concepts such as status, or properties not implicated in any of the original domains can also emerge in the blended space. In terms of Peirce's tenfold typology of signs, the beadwork as a sign for the concept of status is a denotative symbolic rule, due to the purely arbitrary nature of the general rule guiding its interpretation. When a beadwork was worn, the denotative symbolic rule would have been associated with a denotative indexical rule that would indicate through spatiotemporal contiguity the person whose status is of concern. The meaning of the resulting informative symbolic rule would have therefore been the proposition that such cell beads signify the wearer's status. Due to their indexical underpinning, beadworks would have been taken to mediate the symbolic concept of status in a bidirectional fashion. They would have referenced the wearer's status as well as conferred on it. Such informative symbolic rules would have eventually scaffolded the development of truth-tending symbolic rules, such as symbolic rituals. Unlike language-like systems, these cultural constructs would have taken the form of syllogisms connected through one-to-one associations between premises leading to a conclusion. So let us now finally talk about some key conclusions that best be highlighted. The first one is that the meaning of material signification is not akin to that of language. Its meaning is not necessarily purely arbitrary. It can also be based on iconicity and indexicality. We also saw that the meaning of material signification is not the epiphenomenal product of internal representations. Concepts are not predefined by cognitive modules. They are instead developed through the anchoring of conceptual blends to the material world. Though I should note here that this is just one model of how the signifier and the signified co-emerge, and that this process of co-emergence between expression and content could be explained through the diagram as conceived by Peirce. This is something that Claudio has already recognized. Moreover, applying our composite framework to early body ornamentation showed us that the origins of symbolism can be explained through a process of semiotic scaffolding, in which icons and indices must have provided the foundations for the emergence of more arbitrary forms of sociocultural meaning. Reaching the purely arbitrary thoughts guiding cultural syllogisms would have meant attuning to the semiotic grounds presented in actual perceptual contexts. It should be noted here that I'm not making a deterministic postulation that rising through these levels would have taken place in a linear and step-like fashion, where according to Sonneson, signs fall under different kinds rather than degrees of complication. Nonetheless, the relations of embodiment in Peirce's tenfold typology should give us a rough idea of how rituals, which can be seen as cultural syllogisms, that is, as argumentative symbolic legisigns, could have depended on artifactual sign vehicles with physical relations and qualities, such as diacentic indexical sin signs and rhematic iconic sin signs. While the relations between these significative sorts are best seen as bidirectional in that artifacts support rituals and rituals dictate the form and use of artifacts, it should be fair to assume that the similarity and contiguity or factoriality between things would have been conceived in significative terms before the appearance of purely arbitrary concepts and practices. To this extent, the emergence of iconic and indexical material signs, such as early body ornaments, must have catalyzed the emergence of symbolic narratives, such as rituals, while strengthening our penchant for visual signs, bodily and artifactual. Making these claims was obviously the result of implementing semiotic theory to questions traditionally concerning cognitive archaeologists. Based on what we've seen, I think it would be fair to say that prehistorians might have something to gain from semiotics when studying past forms of material and visual signification. And at the same time, I hope that semioticians might find questions about the human becoming interesting enough to tackle with their own tools and methods. Many thanks for listening.